Hello, and welcome to a Researcher's Guide to Practical Ethics. This is episode 2, including vulnerable adults in research. And I'm Dr. Victoria Shepherd from the Centre for Trials Research in the School of Medicine. And why are we talking about this today? Well, informed consent is an ethical and legal requirement for participation in research. Participants should be informed about what's involved, the potential risks and benefits, and their rights. But some people may have additional communication and capacity needs, and some may lack capacity to provide their own consent. And that might be due to a long-term condition such as dementia, or associated with a learning disability. It may be due to an acute or critical illness, or perhaps at the very end of life. There can be ethical concerns about research involving vulnerable groups, which means that there are special legal arrangements in place to ensure their ethical inclusion in research. But because of these concerns, we know that they are often excluded from research which is relevant to them, and so are denied the opportunity to participate in and benefit from research. And this is partly due to our lack of knowledge as researchers about these ethical and legal requirements. So in this session, we will look at some of the key principles that apply to research involving adults with impaired capacity to consent. You may well be very familiar with the key principles that underpin capacity from a healthcare perspective. So capacity is considered to be decision and time specific. It can fluctuate and change over time. There is a legal presumption that adults have capacity under the Mental Capacity Act in England and Wales and the Adults with Incapacity Act in Scotland. And we must do everything practicable to enable people to make a decision for themselves. But whilst these still apply to consent from a research perspective, there are also some differences. There's an exception to the best interest principle for research, as there are other safeguards in place. And clinical trials of medicines and devices involving adults lacking capacity are regulated separately under the clinical trial regulations, which apply across the whole of the UK. And this means that the legal frameworks and ethical approvals processes for studies involving adults lacking capacity differ across the UK. For example, whilst both have arrangements for a family member or friend to be involved in decisions about research, they are known as a personal consultee, unless it is a clinical trial, in which case they are termed a personal legal representative. Or if there isn't anyone to act in a personal capacity, then a professional can act as either a nominated consultee or, for clinical trials, a professional legal representative. In both cases, consultees provide advice to researchers who then make a decision about whether to include the person. There is no consent in these circumstances. But for clinical trials, a legal representative does provide informed consent on the person's behalf. So it's important to review and be familiar with these requirements when planning a study involving these populations. When planning a study, there are a number of requirements that must be borne in mind. When developing participant information, as we usually do, we need to think about accessibility issues. We also need to think about that presumption of capacity, but think about how and when capacity may need to be assessed in our study. We need to have a process for identifying appropriate consultee or legal representative, whether that be from a personal or professional perspective. We need to provide them with appropriate versions of the information sheets. And of course, we might need to plan ahead, so might participants' capacity change over time? And remember that consent doesn't survive the loss of capacity unless it is a clinical trial governed by the clinical trial regulations. And if so, you'll need to include a statement about the process that will be followed in the information sheet consent form you give to participants. And of course, we need to assess capacity where needed and revisit consent as appropriate during the study. And what are the key issues to consider when applying for ethical approval? And that, of course, will depend on what type of research and where you'll be recruiting participants. Importantly, all studies involving adults lacking capacity, whether they involve the NHS or not, have to be reviewed by a Health Research Authority or Health and Care Research Wales Ethics Committee. They can't be reviewed by a university ethics committee. And the areas the REC will consider are shown in the diagram. This includes that the research must be connected with the impairing condition or the care or treatment for that condition, and it must be justified, so you must show whether or not the research could be carried out just as effectively if it only included participants who are able to give consent. And this might not be in the ways you initially expect. So, for example, one of our studies involved care home residents, of whom around 70% will lack capacity to consent due to dementia. But inclusion in our study was justified even though we weren't looking at dementia, we were looking at infections, and so it wasn't directly linked with dementia or an impairing condition. And we demonstrated that because we had previous data showing that care home residents lacking capacity were much more likely to develop infections and need antibiotics than those who had capacity, we demonstrated how we needed to involve that population in our study. You'll also need to show that you have arrangements in place for appointing consultees or legal representatives and for providing them with appropriate information. And also that you have the additional safeguards in place that are required, that you've considered changes in capacity, and that you've prepared documents to support each stage of the process. So a document for the consultee or legal representative, but also if the participant recovers capacity, they may need to consent to continue in the study, and so you'll need information sheets for them as well. And thinking about that principle that we must do everything practicable to enable people to make a decision for themselves and provide their own consent, there are a number of strategies we can think about how we can improve accessibility and support communication and decision making in research. We can think about how we present information. We might present simpler concepts first and then build on that through layering information. We need to think about how we'll be providing the information, whether in person or not, or in a different route. We need to think about what format it will be in and the environment in which it will be delivered. And of course, thinking about how we can tailor all of that to ensure we meet that person's individual needs. To give you some examples, this is a range of information sheets from one of our studies where we used summary versions and pictorial versions, which could then be used to layer information using the full information sheet where appropriate. You can think about easy read versions of information sheets and consent forms. And there are tools such as this consent support tool, which was developed by speech and language therapists to help assess a person's individual communication and support needs. And then we also need to think about intersectionality considerations, where someone may have communication needs but don't have English as a first language, and may need to think about translations of things like easy read documents. For some people, even when provided with support, they may be unable to provide their own consent. This diagram summarises the stages for recruiting adults who lack capacity to consent. Where there are concerns about someone's capacity, the process for assessing capacity for consent research is the same as for other types of decisions. And in line with the principle that it should be the person who requires the decision to be made who should undertake the assessment, this would usually be the researcher. But of course they will involve those who know the person well, so their family members and members of their usual care team, for example. If they are assessed as lacking capacity to consent to the study, then someone else should be involved to help make a decision about participation on their behalf. In accordance with the legal frameworks we've already talked about, this should preferably be someone who knows that person in a personal capacity, so a family member or close friend. They don't need to hold a lasting power of attorney, and there's no hierarchy of which family member should be involved. If there are no family members or friends willing or able to act, then someone acting in a professional capacity can be involved. But importantly, they must not be connected to the study. In either case, they then provide advice on the person's behalf, or if it's a clinical trial, they provide consent. And in both cases, this is documented in some form. So it would either be on a consultee declaration form, or for a clinical trial, a consent form. And the person lacking capacity should of course be provided with appropriate information, and any signs that they object or wish to be withdrawn in any way should be adhered to. But there is no requirement to gain their assent, unlike for research involving children. And of course this is an ongoing process, so if there are any concerns that the person's capacity has changed at any point, then this process may need to be revisited. And to help and support you, there are a whole host of resources out there that I and others have developed. Many of these have been collated into a website, including links to the Health Research Authority pages that have a lot of specialist information. There are summaries of the legal frameworks and where they differ and how they apply, and everything from top tips on assessing capacity to consent research to how emergency research is conducted, where consent may not be possible and it may not be possible to involve family members due to the nature of the emergency. There's also lots of training available, both from the National Institute for Health and Care Research, and I've recently developed a specific e-learning course on the topic. And then there are tools, such as the framework you can see, that helps break down the questions you need to ask yourself when designing a study involving adults with impaired capacity consent. And all of these can be accessed through the website link you can see at the bottom of the page. So just to conclude a few points. When planning a study, we need to consider issues around communication and capacity needs at the earliest stage. If we are going to be including people who may lack capacity to consent, we need to review the relevant legal frameworks and look at the requirements for research ethics approvals. And of course, these may differ depending on the type of research and where in the UK we're recruiting participants. We need to develop appropriate study processes and materials that enable people to make their own decision where possible. We need to think about mapping the different consent pathways and develop appropriate documents for each stage. For example, where someone lacks capacity, have documents for their consultee or legal representative, but where they may regain capacity, we need to have documents for the participant themselves. We need to think about accessing the training, tools and resources that are freely available to help us, and importantly to be aware of any misinterpretation or misapplication, so being wary about using examples from other types of studies that may come under different legal frameworks or where they may not have interpreted the requirements correctly. And most importantly, we have an important role for public and patient involvement, and that needs to be inclusive of these populations. So we need to think about the methods we're using, and that is essential throughout. Or you can always contact me on my email, which is shepherdvl1@cardiff.ac.uk, or via the Research on Research team, and you can see their email on the screen.